Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Slugs and Steins, lectures from UC Santa Cruz. My name is April Yee. I'm the VP of Finance for the UCSC Alumni Council and an alumni counselor, and I'm one of your volunteer organizers tonight. With me is Julia Doloff, a fellow alumni counselor and chair of the volunteer committee, who will be moderating the talk with me tonight. This talk is being recorded and will appear in a few days on the UCSC Arts, Lectures, and Entertainment channel on YouTube. For those who are new, our Slugs and Steins series engages a UC Santa Cruz faculty member in discussion with you, our local and extended community online, with a goal of making you feel like you're back at UC Santa Cruz sitting in class, but with a drink in your hand and without tests. Even though this is a virtual event, I'd like to begin with the UCSC land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsin tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. Now, since we can't see you, we'd like to know where you're zooming in from and how many people are watching, and if you're an alum, what year you graduated and what college you're affiliated with. So please take a moment to fill out a short poll, and we'll share the results after we've given everyone a moment to respond. All right, have we gotten enough responses? Okay, so lots of folks just watching on their own from Santa Cruz and other regions in California. And a lot of the decades, 70s, 80s, 90s, lots of 2000s, and a good disbursement of colleges, except none from College 9 and 10, which is where our guest is a provost of. All right, well, um, this evening, we're happy to welcome Kimberly Lau, Professor of Literature and Provost of College 9 and John R. Lewis College. She is the author of a number of books as well as articles in interdisciplinary journals. Her research interests include fairy tales, folklore, and fantasy, feminist theory, and critical race studies, and the intersection of popular and political cultures and monster studies. This evening's talk is titled Race and the European Fairy Tale, the Making of a White Genre. We'll have opportunities for Q&A at the end of the talk, but you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. And if you see someone else's question that you like, you can upvote it and we'll prioritize the questions with the most upvotes. Okay, does everyone have their steins? I've got your slug, Professor Kim Lau.
Great. Thank you, April. And thanks to the Alumni Association for organizing this and for inviting me. The last time I did one of these, it was Prof in a Pint, and it was live and in person, and people were dressed up for Halloween. It was really a lot of fun. So thank you for inviting me again. I'm going to share some slides right now. Hopefully. Is that showing up the right way for you?
Not yet. I think it still has to be shared as a slideshow.
Wait, we just practiced this. Okay. It says I'm screen sharing.
You should be able to click play from start there on the left. Yeah, and then just swap your displays.
Swap it again. And do what, Julia? Use slideshow.
Yes.
Better?
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry. Thanks everyone for your patience. Again, welcome. I want to begin tonight by conjuring the world of the European fairy tale. So if you'll bear with me, maybe if you would close your eyes for a second and imagine yourself in a fairy tale world. Maybe you see a castle and a village next to the castle, maybe on the verge of a forest. What else do you see? Look around that world and notice what's contained in that world of the fairy tale. And then, um, and then maybe select from one of these options what you see. Could be all of them or some of them. I made it pretty easy. It's not a test. April said that there were going to be no tests. Okay. Do we have some results? Okay, good. So, you saw a little bit of everything. You're very familiar with a typical fairy tale world. Now, I'd like to ask another question, which is, oops, why are my slides not advancing? Which is whether you saw anyone who is not white in that imagined fairy tale world that you just entered. Oh, okay, good. So about a third of you saw people who are not white. I would love to hear more about that in the Q&A because ordinarily when I ask this question, there's pretty much nobody who says that they see somebody who's not white in the fairy tale world that they have imagined. And I'd like to begin with this exercise because I think it really foregrounds for us the taken for grantedness of the white world of the fairy tale. And I want to begin by really stressing that for me, the it's no accident that the world of the European fairy tale is a white one. And it's not because everyone in Europe at the time that the fairy tale originated, which for our purposes tonight, I would say is the late 16th century, the early 17th century, so the early modern period. It's not because everybody in Europe at that time was white. It's really because ideas about race during that period were critical to the very development and formation of the fairy tale as a genre. And that's what I want us to talk about and think about tonight. I'm going to start by talking about the very first collection of European fairy tales, which is Jean-Baptiste Basile's The Tale of Tales. It was composed in the early 17th century and then published posthumously between 1634 and 1636. And this first collection of European fairy tales hinges on the actions of a black slave girl. So the volume, the collection is organized into 5 days of storytelling. And it's set within a frame tale. That is, we have to have a justification or a rationale for why we are having these 5 days of storytelling. And the frame tale is what I want to talk about a little bit. And this is what hinges on the actions of the slave. So the frame tale begins with a melancholy princess. Her name is Zosa. She never laughs. And her father, the king, is really concerned that his daughter never laughs. So he brings in all sorts of entertainments, jesters, court entertainers, everything he can think of. And Zosa is resolute in her melancholy. She will not laugh. So out of desperation, the king thinks, well, as a last resort, I'm going to install a public fountain of oil because that will just likely lead to something, some kind of mishap, or some kind of encounter or some kind of oddity that will make Zosa laugh. And in fact, he's right. So he installs this fountain of oil, and this old woman comes along.
Kim, are there slides that we should be following along because we see the last question?
Not yet.
Okay. Just
Yeah, I'm
wanted to
not. I
check.
should put in like a buffer slide, but I didn't. Coming up.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So there's this fountain of oil, and this old woman comes along, and she is filling up her jug with oil. It's free, like olive oil. This is Italy. It's olive before it was Italy, but it's olive oil. And a court page sees her, and he thinks it'd be really funny if he throws a rock at her and breaks the jug of oil, and that's exactly what he does. And they get into this really like colorful exchange of insults and curses, because the woman is so upset, and she's angry beyond words, and they're cursing each other. And I should say, this is not the fairy tale language that you're probably familiar with from the Grimms or the 19th or early 20th century fairy tales. It's really been cleaned up for children. This is like early 17th century body, like rough language. So their exchange is full of curses about like how his mother is a prostitute, and just kind of what we could imagine. And their angry exchange ends when the old woman, quote, raises her stage curtain and reveals a woodsy scene. Okay, so that's just a language, like an example of the language of sexuality. But in any case, it's so funny that this old woman raises her stage curtain and reveals a woodsy scene that Zosa finally laughs. And um, Zosa's laughing, of course, only compounds the old woman's rage. And so the old woman turns to Zosa and she curses her. And the curse is that will only be one potential man that she can ever marry. So there's only one husband for her, and that potential husband is Prince Taddeo of Roundfield, which is really far away. And on top of it, he himself is cursed. So he's cursed to an enchanted sleep. He's kind of like Sleeping Beauty. He's himself, but he's asleep. And the only way that he can be disenchanted is if a woman comes along and fills a dedicated pitcher that's hanging next to his coffin with tears in 3 days' time. Um, which seems like a pretty impossible task. So melancholy Zosa, though, is up for the challenge, and she sets off and she travels for 7 years to find Prince Taddeo. And during that time, she encounters three fairy sisters, one after another, and they write letters of introduction to the next sister. And each sister gives her as a gift a magical nut and says to her, only open this magical nut in your greatest time of need. So she collects these three nuts and she finds Taddeo, and she starts telling her story. And, lo and behold, in like 2 days, the pitcher is almost full. Like there's just a little bit left at the very end. And she's exhausted because if you've ever cried a lot, you know how exhausting that can be. So she is exhausted from all of this crying. She decides that she's going to take a nap, or she falls asleep. Okay, cut to the slave now. And I'm going to read the next section from the text because I want you to get a flavor of the racism that I would argue motivates this whole collection. So I'm just going to read a few scenes. I want my slides. Okay. In the meantime, there arrived a certain crooked-legged slave girl who often went to that fountain to fill her urn, and who knew about the epitaph business since talk of it was everywhere. When she saw Zosa crying so hard to make those two trickles of tears, she sat for a long time and spied on her, waiting until the pitcher was almost full so that she could wrench that fine booty from Zosa's hands and leave her with a fistful of flies. As soon as she saw that Zosa was asleep, she took advantage of the opportunity and skillfully slipped the pitcher out from under her, placed her own eyes above it, and in 4 snaps filled it. The moment it was filled to the brim, the prince got out of his coffin of white stone as if he were awakening from a long sleep, took hold of that mass of black flesh, and carried her off to his palace, where, amid festivities and royal fireworks, he made her his wife. But when Zosa awoke and found the pitcher overturned, and with it her hopes, and saw the coffin open, her heart squeezed shut so tightly that she nearly unpacked the parcels of her soul at the custom house of death. Finally, realizing that there was no remedy for her ills and that all she had to complain about were her own eyes, which had insufficiently guarded the calf of her hopes, she set off, one foot after another, until she arrived at the city. There she heard of the prince's festivities and of the fine sort of wife he had taken, and at once imagined what must have happened, exclaiming with a sigh that two black things had brought her to her downfall, sleep and a slave. Okay, so Zosa moves into the house across from the palace and sits by the window every day. And of course, Tadeo sees her and immediately falls in love with her because, it's a fairy tale. And at the same time, it turns out we learn that the slave girl, who's often called the slave wife or the same princess, she's not yet given a name. She turns out, probably not surprising, given everything that you just read and heard, to be a pretty nasty, domineering wife. And she gets pregnant almost immediately, and she uses that pregnancy. So Zosa is pretty despairing, and she realizes that if there's any time to use her magical nuts, now is the time. So she opens the first nut, and out pops like a little tiny magical man, and she puts him on the windowsill, and he starts singing. And the slave wife sees this little singing man and is so enchanted that she must have this little magical man. So she tells Tadeo in this what would have been considered at the time a Moorish patois, like a broken language that would have been associated with slaves. And she says something along the lines of like, me want that man, if get it for me, little Georgie kill. That's the baby. And so that happens on the first day. And then on the second day, Zosa opens her second nut and out pops like a little golden hen and all her chicks, and they're, going along the windowsill, and the slave wife again must have them, and she demands that, and she threatens the baby. And so Tadeo goes over, and whenever he goes over, Zosa just says, oh, you don't have to buy them from me. You can just have them. They're a gift, and she gives them. On the third day, she opens the third nut and out pops a little doll, a magical doll, and she whispers in the doll's ear to instill in the slave wife a desire to hear stories. And so Tadeo comes, Zosa gives him the gift, he takes it back, and of course, it instills in the slave wife a desire to hear stories. And so that is what leads to the 5 days of storytelling that constitutes this collection. So he calls together all these old women who are like deformed and ugly and just awful descriptions of them, because that was the impression of who the best storytellers would be. So there are 10 storytellers, and they each tell a story every day for 5 days, and it's an introduction, and that's the frame. So let's set that frame tale aside for a moment, and I want to tell another story that is very similar. It has a lot of parallels. It's the penultimate story, that is the 49th story of the collection, The 50th story is the end of the frame tale. And this 49th story, called The Three Citrons, leads into that. But I think you'll see a lot of similarities between the Three Citrons and the frame tale. So the Three Citrons begins with a prince who doesn't want to get married because he doesn't find any women that he fancies. He thinks they're mostly all below him. And one day he is eating and he cuts his finger on accident, and the blood drips on the ricotta cheese. And he sees this beautiful combination of the red blood and the white ricotta. And he says, "Oh, I will marry a woman if she is as beautiful, if she has this color combination and she's as beautiful as this blood on the ricotta." So he sets off to find this woman of his dreams, the bloody ricotta. And he goes through many trials and tribulations. And after many years, he meets an old woman. And the old woman gives him three citrons, like little oranges, and says, hold on to these and return to your kingdom. And outside of your kingdom, stop at that fountain and cut the citron open. The first one, cut one of the citrons open. And when you do that, a fairy is going to pop out. But make sure, and she'll be as beautiful as, as your ricotta cheese with blood on it. And so, but make sure that you have water ready for her, because as soon as she pops out, you're going to have to give her a drink of water. So he cuts the first citron open and this beautiful fairy pops out, but he's not fast enough. So she doesn't get the water and she vanishes. And so he goes to the second citron and he cuts it open and the fairy pops out and the same thing happens. So now he's down to his last citron. It's a fairy tale. There's always three. So, his chances are pretty good that this one's going to work out. He cuts that citron open. The fairy pops out and he gets the water to her, and they fall immediately in love again because it's fairy tale. And he says, "Okay, you wait here at this fountain. I'm going to go back to my kingdom and get royal clothing for you and royal transport so that we can go to the palace in the style that you deserve." So this fairy waits in a tree above the fountain. Okay, this is all a lead up to the part of the story that I think is most interesting. So what happens here then, and here's where I think you're going to see a lot of resonances with the frame tale, because this next part of the story also features a slave girl, much like the slave girl in the frame tale who stole Tadeo from Zosa. And just as an aside, I should note that both of these slave girls' stories begin with literally the language of the tale is "in the meantime," suggesting that their stories are interludes or interruptions into the main narrative of the white protagonist, who is ostensibly the rightful bride. So that's just a little side note. Okay, so as in the frame tale, this part of the story also takes place at this fountain, where the slave girl has been sent to fetch water. And of course, she doesn't know that this beautiful fairy is waiting in the tree above the fountain. So as she's filling her jug with water, she sees the fairy's reflection in the fountain and she mistakes it for her own reflection. And of course, she's keenly aware of the color-coded logic of slavery of the time. So she begins to question her status. And she says, "What you see, unfortunate Lucia, you be so beautiful, and mistress sends you to get water, and me put up with this. Oh, unfortunate Lucia." And here again, this is another example of that Moorish patois that Basile uses to signal the language that slaves would have spoken at the time. So she thinks, I'm so beautiful. I am not a slave. What am I doing? So she breaks the water jug and she returns home empty-handed. And her mistress is none too happy. So the next day, the same thing. She goes, this time she has a barrel to fill up. And again, she sees the fairy's reflection, thinking it's her own. And she says, me no thick-lipped slave, me no Allah lover, me no wiggle ass, me so beautiful and me bring barrel to fountain. So again, she breaks the water bottle and or the water barrel and she goes home. But the mistress is not buying these lies anymore. The mistress is like, I've had enough of this. And she beats her savagely. And there's an extended description of the beating that this poor slave girl gets. And so, fearing another beating, she goes to the fountain for the third time. And again, seeing her, quote unquote, her reflection, she once again refuses her status as a slave. And she says, me be stupid to get water. Better if Georgia marry. This no beauty to die angry and serve cross mistress. So I'll get to the names a little bit later. The fact that she refers to herself both as Lucia and Georgia, that's significant, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But to continue the story, she has this goatskin bag that she's now filling with water, and she takes a hairpin and she pokes it all over. And so if you can imagine a goatskin bag, kind of like a Boda bag, and now all this water is spraying out from it. And this sight makes the fairy in the tree laugh. And so all of a sudden, Georgia understands kind of the underlying source of her beatings, right? She blames the fairy for this. But Georgia thinks, oh, I can maybe take advantage of the situation. So she engages the fairy in conversation, and the fairy, who's extremely naive, because you have to remember she was just born from a citron a couple days ago. She tells her story to Georgia, and Georgia really connives to take her place. So she offers to comb the fairy's hair and to help get her ready for the prince's return. So she climbs up in the tree and she's combing her hair, and she takes the same hairpin that she used to poke the goatskin bag, and she pricks the fairy's scalp, and all of a sudden the fairy disappears, turns into a white dove, and flies away. So the prince then returns, and upon seeing the slave in the tree where he's expecting to see the fairy, unleashes this like torrent of racialized metaphors. He says, who put this ink blot on the royal paper where I plan to write my happiest days? Who draped with black mourning the freshly whitewashed house where I thought I would take all my pleasures? Who would have me find this touchstone where I left a silver mine destined to make me rich and beautiful? And to this, the cunning slave says, not to marvel, my prince, for presto, me be enchanted, 1 year white face, 1 year black ass. So here, just as an aside, we see that the idea of blackness as an accursed state was so widely understood and accepted in this cultural moment that even the most uneducated slave girl would have been familiar with that kind of blackness as a certain kind of curse. So despite Georgia's patois, which is again a clear marker of her slave status, and also despite the fact that the prince was, quote, swollen with rage and incensed beyond belief, he decides to take her to the kingdom. He dresses her in the royal garb and he takes her to the kingdom, and the parents bestow their crowns upon them, and they're married. And so the royal cooks are preparing festive celebratory meals, and a dove, a white dove, appears in the kitchen and says, do I have this on? Nope, sorry, let me go back. It says, cook in the kitchen, what is the king doing with the Saracen? And this happens, of course, 3 days in a row. The dove appears and asks the same thing. And this repeated questioning initiates a series of events that ultimately leads to the rebirth of the fairy, again from a citron, and to the false bride's exposure and to her death. And very often in fairy tales, the king or the prince will tell a story and then ask the false bride, what would you do to punish somebody who did this action? And the false bride will give a description of how the person should be killed, and then that's the way that they're killed. And that's what happens in this situation. So the false bride is killed. This then returns us to the frame tale. And the parallels are so tight between this story and the frame tale that the storytellers who are collected there, they begin to kind of discuss amongst themselves whether it was improper for the person who told the story to have told it, because it's so similar to the situation that they find themselves in with this slave wife. And it so happens that on this fifth day, one of the storytellers is sick, and so Zosa is invited to substitute for her, and she has an opportunity to tell her story. And as she's beginning to tell her story, the slave wife, starts to get nervous and is unsettled and is trying to prevent her from telling the story, but Tadeo insists. And so, of course, Zosa tells her story, and then Tadeo, even though he had been motivated to do all these things to protect his unborn child, orders Lucia, now the slave wife, is named for the very first time at the moment of her execution. She's named. He orders Lucia, who is also pregnant, to be buried alive with, quote, only her head above ground, so that her death would be far more tortured. And then he and Zosa are married. So these two stories are really critical to the Tale of Tales as a collection as a whole. And remember, the Tale of Tales is the first European collection of fairy tales. And so I think I want to suggest that through these characters, Lucia in the frame tale and Georgia in the Three Citron, we can really see how Basile's slave characters, and there are other literal black slave characters in the collection, and I can talk about that during the Q&A if you're interested. But I think we can see how these Basile's slave characters condense dominant ideas and beliefs about slaves in the Italian cultural imagination of the period. And this is, of course, before Italy was Italy per se, but people refer to it as Italy after the fact now. So according to these tales and to Basile's logic, female slaves are prone to duplicity and thievery. They're generally untrustworthy. They're willing to use pregnancy to their advantage. They're linguistically deficient, and they are deserving of unchecked physical and verbal abuse. At the same time, their ethnic and religious otherness, that is, you'll remember they're called Moors, Saracens, Allah lovers. So their ethnic and religious otherness is tethered to their blackness, and that blackness is punctuated by racialized physical markers, such as you've seen already: cricket-legged, thick-lipped, wiggle ass. And all of these descriptions were part of a culturally recognizable language of racial and ethnic difference for Basile's audience. They would have fully understood these, even if we don't necessarily see them in that way. But in addition, as you've also already seen, Basile also uses these really extended metaphors, specifically of blackness, to deepen sort of the cultural associations of the period between blackness and a dehumanized otherness. So again, examples: a mass of black flesh, a black thing, that black night of a slave, statue of jet, ink block, black mourning draped on the freshly whitewashed house. And even when Basile moves away from metaphors of blackness, he still invokes a sort of a dehumanizing language of animality. So we also see these slaves referred to as monkey, bitch, horse, crow. Um, so I want to talk about one specific example from the collection that is extremely layered and really, I think, gets at the figurative language of slavery and how it's working. And it will also help explain for us the slave girl from the Three Citrons. It'll help explain for us her use of both Georgia and Lucia to refer to her. So this comes from a story called The Two Little Pizzas, which is a story of the kind and unkind girls where, you know, one girl shares her pizza with a hungry beggar and the other girl doesn't. And then, of course, different things happen to them. So in this story, which is the seventh story on the fourth day, Basile describes nightfall as when that black Moor of a night came out to play tuba cachuba with the stars. So understood, like this to us is incomprehensible, or at least for most of us. To me, it was incomprehensible, but understood within its cultural context, this is a metaphor of racialized difference, and it encodes a series of associations that are implicit in its cultural references, which I'm going to unpack. And eventually, this extended metaphor leads us back to Georgia and Lucia, who have proved so critical to the collection as a whole, as I've been arguing. So, tuba katuba is a dance similar to this dance called Svesania, which is often conflated with the dance of Lucia, also commonly known as Bitchy Lucia. And then from a footnote in an Italian edition of The Tale of Tales, which was translated by Nancy Canepa for the edition that I used, we get this more extended explanation. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Moorish dance of Lucia was widely performed in Naples. It derived from the ecstatic dances of possession, characterized by continuous spinning, like those that today are still performed by dervishes. Already desacralized in the 16th century, it was transformed into a ritualistic carnival performance. The ambiguous character of Lucia was played by a man in blackface, dressed as an Oriental woman, whose song and movements referred to the sexual act, birth, death, and resurrection. The accompanying chorus insulted Lucia with the epithet of bitch. Later, this dance was confused with the dance of Spasania, which took its name from the city of Fez in Morocco. In addition, Lucia was a stock character in a genre of street theater known as Luciate, and at least one published version of Luciata exists, and this dates from 1628, which you'll remember coincides with the time that Basile was composing The Tale of Tales. So as you can see here, it's written in a theatrical language akin to the Moorish patois that Basile's Lucia and Georgia use. Lucia is portrayed as a flirt who dances uninhibitedly in ways that mimic copulation, and her infidelity results in having an illegitimate child at the end of the play. So here, I think now we begin to see how this racialized and sexualized cultural productions of Lucia, that is the Neapolitan dance and the street theater, they help us make sense of some of Basile's references or descriptions that we might not necessarily have understood, like wiggle ass, for instance. So we can see the way that something like wiggle ass is actually a racialized stereotype of Black women in this time period. And that would have been completely comprehensible to his audience. But I also want to add that Lucia was not just the name given to these dances and to the street theater. It was also one of the top 2 or 3 names that were given to slaves who were brought to Italy during the early modern period. And by Basile's time, Lucia had become a generic term for a female slave. So if we think back to the 3 citrons, it now makes sense that Georgia refers to herself as Lucia in the first 2 instances, where we don't know that her name is actually Georgia until the final instance. Um, let's see. I'm trying to do a little bit of a time check. Okay. I'm going to have to cut some stuff. Uh, just to kind of wrap up this section, in both instances, it's really the slave girls' improper sexuality, that is their status as false brides, right? They both steal the intended grooms of the white protagonist, that drives the story. And so in this way, the name Lucia functions as an aptronym, which is a very common in fairy tales. It's like an apt naming, like Sleeping Beauty or Snow White. And here, it, uh, Basile makes good use of this, and he makes it explicit when in the conclusion of the frame tale, he says, when he's talking about Lucia's attempts to kind of intervene in Zosa's story, he says, quote, Lucia truly acted like a Lucia. So how I have until like 7:25.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Um, I'm just trying to see what I'm going to cut. Okay. So basically, the important takeaway from the Tale of Tales is that as the first European collection of fairy tales, this collection influenced the subsequent fairy tale collections that we have, the canonical ones. So the French fairy tales of the late 17th century and into the 18th century, the German collection, the Grimms of the early 19th century, and then Andrew Lang's fairy tales of the world from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And the fact that so much of the collection depends on the machinations of the Black slave girl is, to my mind, very important. It sets a paradigm for the way that race is integrated into the very genre of the fairy tale. And then that becomes, we go from this very explicit racialized context and world to the white world of the fairy tale. And the way we get there is through metaphorizations that accumulate over time on top of this underlying racial foundation. So let's fast forward a couple hundred years to Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm's fairy tale collection, Children's and Household Tales, which was first published in 1812. And I'm going to focus here on one tale in particular called The White Bride and the Black Bride. And as the title suggests, it's very similar to the tales that I've already told. So basically, it's a story of a kind and unkind girls, which is a subgroup of fairy tales, and true and false brides, which is also a subgroup that you've already heard about. It begins when God comes to earth disguised as a poor man, and he asks directions of a woman, her daughter, and her stepdaughter. And the woman and the daughter are really haughty and unkind to him. But the stepdaughter steps up. She's very generous. She shows him the way. God is, of course, angered by the insolence of the woman and the daughter. And oh, sorry, this is the part I'm skipping. So he, quote, turned his back on them and cursed them so that they became black as night and ugly as sin. Meanwhile, he asks the stepdaughter, the kind girl, what she would like as a reward, and he says that he'll give her 3 wishes. And she asks to be beautiful and pure as the sun. That's a quote, upon which God makes her as white and beautiful as the day. And then she wants, never to be poor, and she wants to go to heaven after death. The when the stepmother sees that she and her daughter are black as coal and ugly, while the stepdaughter was white and beautiful, she really begins to plot about how she can get back at the daughter. Um, Meanwhile, the stepdaughter has a brother called Ragnar. He is the coachman to the king. He loves his sister so much, he asks, can I have a portrait painted of you, so I can see you every day? And she says, sure, but only if you're the only one who looks at it. And then, and he upholds that promise. And then the king's wife dies, and the king is beside himself, not so much out of, a mourning, but because he can't find an equal to his wife in terms of beauty. The king's servants, the other servants, are really jealous of Ragnar, so they kind of tattle on him and tell the king, oh, he looks at this portrait. We've seen him through the keyhole. He looks at this portrait every day. So the king goes in and sees the portrait, and of course the sister is so beautiful, the king decides that he's going to marry her, and he sends Ragnar with royal clothing to go pick her up. And so this, of course, is the opportunity the stepmother's been waiting for. She uses witchcraft, and she makes Ragnar blind, and she makes the stepdaughter deaf. And as they're traveling back by coach back to the kingdom, she throws the stepdaughter into the river, and when the stepdaughter sinks below the river, she turns into, or a white duck appears on the surface of the river. And then the stepmother dresses her daughter in the beautiful clothes. They arrive at the kingdom. The king is totally furious because his betrothed is abysmally ugly. And so he has Ragnar thrown into a pit of adders and snakes, but the stepmother uses her magic to make the daughter at least acceptable to the king. And so the king marries the daughter, the black bride. And soon after, a white duck appears in the castle kitchen and asks the kitchen boy, about Ragnar, of course, but also what the black witch is doing in the house. And this happens for 3 nights, and the kitchen boy finally tells the king. And on the third night, the king hides in the kitchen. And when he sees the white duck come ask this question, he decapitates it, because that's magically how you often disenchant people. So he decapitates this duck, and it turns into the beautiful woman that he was intending to marry. And so, they save Ragnar, they have the wedding, the stepmother and daughter are killed. What's important about this is that it carries forward the same themes and tropes from Basile's Frame Tale and the Three Citrons. And it's part of a bigger constellation of tales about kind and unkind girls and true and false brides in the Grimm's collection, including uh, uh, what are some of the stories, including Mother Hola, the Three Little Gnomes in the Forest, the Singing Springing Lark, the Goose Girl, and then of course this one. It's also especially noteworthy that the Grimms note the similarities to other European tales of this type, including Basile's Two Little Pizzas, but they completely ignore the frame tale for the Tale of Tales and the Three Citrons, which are specifically racialized. And I should say the Grimms were very familiar with the Tale of Tales because they had planned to translate it. So it's significant to me that they omit any reference in their extensive notes to the two tales of this tale type that are specifically racialized in Basile, while they acknowledge the Two Little Pizzas, which doesn't have any explicit racial references. And then just to carry forward the continuity between them, we see, of course, in the White Bride and the Black Bride, the white duck saying, "What's the black witch doing in the house?" Which of course echoes the pretty white duck asking cook in the kitchen, "What is the king doing with the Saracen?" So again, we see this movement forward. Of course, in the white bride and the black bride, the black bride and her mother are literally black, but they're made black by God in this curse. They're not black in the same way that the Moorish slave is black in Basile's collection. But as we look at the other tales in the Grimm's, the other kind and unkind girls stories and other true and false bride stories, we see metaphors of blackness. So in Mother Holla, for instance, the unkind girl is covered in black pitch because she's lazy and impudent. And in the Three Little Gnomes in the Forest, the girl becomes punished for her wicked and greedy heart, her stinginess, and as a result, she grows uglier every day, and she begins to spit toads from her mouth with every word that she utters. So we see in these tales specific kinds of language, and I can talk about this more in the Q&A if you're interested, that was associated with Blacks and Jews during 19th century, 18th century, and 19th century Germany when the Grimms were producing these. And that moment intellectually was a period when typologies of racial difference were very popular. So it was often the German and the other, the white, beautiful, industrious, kind, and the other. And the primary others were Blacks and Jews, and they were often conflated. And I can talk about that in the Q&A as well. So I'll just give as one example. I think that this example of spitting toads from the mouth is really a literalization, like a very visceral literalization of this very common belief among Germans that Blacks and Jews could never learn to speak German properly. So again, we see racial signifiers and anti-Semitic, racialized anti-Semitic signifiers when we read these tales in their specific historical cultural context. But they are metaphors and yet that contribute to the whiteness of the fairy tale world, even as they're still anchored in those tales that are deeply racialized in Basile. So I'll just wrap up here so that we can really get into the Q&A to say that the fairy tale as a genre is about the marvelous. It's about eccentricities and magic. And so oftentimes when we're reading fairy tales or listening to fairy tales, we don't necessarily stop to think about how weird something is. We just accept that. But when we unpack those weirdnesses, a lot of times we find that those weirdnesses are linked to racial legacies that we just need to decode. And so I argue that the very specific racial foundations of the fairy tale get passed on and totally naturalized because of the marvelous dimension of the genre. So I think I'll end there and we can move to Q&A. And this is my book, which is about this, if you want to read about it. And there's a chapter on the Basile material. There's a much more extensive chapter on the Grimms than what I just offered here. And in between those two, there's a chapter about the French material and about Beauty and the Beast and the way that the original Beauty and the Beast tales in the Basile collection feature handsome black slaves in the Beast character. So I'd be willing or happy to talk about that as well. And then there's a final chapter on Andrew Lang's Colored Fairy Book collection. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I had to cut a little bit there. It's always hard to plan the right time.
No worries. That was great. Thank you so much. So we do have some questions coming in, and as a reminder to anyone out there, please type in your questions into the Q&A. And also you can click on the thumbs up to upvote questions you want to be asked sooner. So don't forget to do that. So our first question is, what was the racial demographic makeup of Europe during the time these fairy tales were written, perhaps particularly for the areas of key fairy tale sources like Italy and Germany?
Those are really great questions. The answers are, of course, different. The Basile was from Naples, which was a port city on the Mediterranean. So it was very racially, ethnically, religiously mixed. There would have been people from North Africa, people from the Spanish Mediterranean. There would have been Islamic influences as well as Christian influences. There were slaves brought in from continental Africa, from Eastern Europe, and it was a very multicultural kind of environment. I can't speak to the exact breakdowns of different populations, but it was very diverse. Germany in the 19th century was uh, also fairly diverse. It the 18th century was this moment in Germany when um, uh, there was a kind of transition from religious anti-Semitism to culturally and racial anti-Semitism. So um, and it was a moment when people were asking questions about Jewish emancipation. So that was, so Jews were seen as, like a different cultural, racial, ethnic group, and they were often conflated with blacks. And there were blacks in Germany at the time, although I don't know what percentage, and I would imagine that it was a quite small percentage. But there are a lot of discourses that talk about Jews and blacks in the same language. So, for instance, there was this um, uh, scholar of ancient Judaism who was he was supportive of ancient Judaism, but he was opposed to Jewish emancipation in the contemporary moment, and he suggested that Germany should create sugar islands to deport Jews to because Jews were suitable for that climate in ways that Germans weren't. So basically, sugar colonies that at that moment in European history were entirely run by African, completely exploited African slaves. So a real conflation of Jews and blacks in that example, for instance.
Hmm. Thank you for that. Raymond says Saracens are definitely Muslim rather than African Black people. Is this religious as much as racial?
Can you ask that again?
Saracens, there's a comment first. Saracens are definitely Muslim rather than African Black people. Is this religious as much as racial?
Yeah, that's a great question. Saracens were not by default black in any way, but they are coded as black in Basile. So there are a lot of examples where Saracen is a stand-in for black. And so in one example, for instance, the Saracen is also the same character is also referred to as the Black Queen, for instance. So it's a particularity of Basile, or it might have been part of a cultural moment, but it's not historically accurate. Yeah.
Thank you. So our next question, this is a long one, so um, just be aware. Thanks for the focus on the racial dynamics in European fairy tales. I'm also wondering if Christianity and colonialism helped demonize powerful women by suppressing the divine feminine. In many non-Western traditions led by women of color, like Japanese priestesses who created kabuki with sacred dance before being banned for corrupting male virtue, spiritual leadership, healing, and sexuality were respected. Could this erasure be tied not just to race, but to Christian patriarchy and its impact on older women-centered spiritual systems?
That's a really good layered, complex question. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. In the Grimms, definitely they were highly invested in Christian patriarchy, and that is very clear. They were anti-Semitic sympathizers for sure, and the sheer number of witches that they have who are demonized in the collection and stepmothers and things like that, I think speak to that sort of patriarchal Christian attitude. There is a little bit of scholarship that reads the stepmother figure as kind of like a metaphor of um, Jewish Black threat, specifically feminine threat to the German family, so i.e. nation as well as nuclear family and the future of reproduction. So I think in that way, I can't really speak to like how much the Grimms were invested in an appropriation of like the divine feminine or anything like that. I don't know that they were really conversant with those kinds of traditions, but they definitely um, wanted to reassert patriarchal, or not reassert, just continue to uphold patriarchal Christian values. And the collection as a whole was considered basically like a primer for teaching bourgeois Christian children proper behavior. So that would have included proper gender behavior as well.
Thank you. Sean asks, is there any clear definition of fairy tales that would link them uniquely to Europe? When asked the question about non-whites in a fairy tale, I was thinking about stories from China, Japan, and India. Are Asian fairy tales put into a different classification?
That is a great question, and that's a question that I'd love to talk about. The, my work is focused specifically on the European fairy tale and the emergence of that fairy tale. But I do think that but at the end of my book, I talk about kind of disciplinary colonialism, right? So this idea in the 19th century, so when the Grimms published their collection, it became wildly popular, not in Germany, but in translation in England, especially. And it also inspired a lot of other European collecting projects that were used in the service of nationalism. And one of the things that emerged from that was this idea that the fairy tale was universal, that the European fairy tale was universal. And so people created indices and guides and typologies and collections like Andrew Lang's collection, a series of 12 fairy books called the Color Fairy Books in the late 19th and early 20th century, and really asserted that the fairy tale was universal, and so included like stories that had been collected by missionaries and anthropologists in Africa and South America and in New Zealand and Australia from native groups, also natives in North America, but insisted on this umbrella term as the fairy tale. And I think that's really done damage. So all of that to say that um, I think I don't think it's going out too much on a limb to say that all cultures have stories. I don't know that all cultures have what they would call in their own language fairy tale. I think fairy tale has been mapped onto that. And I think we have in the US a publishing industry that really commodifies that. And so wants to say this is the Chinese Cinderella, this is the Japanese Cinderella, this is the Korean Cinderella, this is the African Cinderella. And often when you look at those stories, there's only maybe one motif that's similar, like maybe there's a missing shoe, and that's enough for it to get squeezed into that. So I think that there are indigenous intellectual narrative categories. Um, that have been subsumed under the title of the fairy tale, but that I don't know that they're that it's an indigenous category everywhere. Yeah.
Thank you.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so Marcia asks, are the tales in Basile's stories based on genuine folk tales, or are they primarily the imaginative construction of the author?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So they're they're literary inventions based on Basile's understanding or imagination of what oral storytelling was like. But there was, of course, oral storytelling happening at that time, but these are not like collected and recorded or even trying to be entirely in the voice of a traditional storyteller in that way. Basile was really interested in the Baroque, so he was really interested in inversion. And that line I quoted about she lifted her stage curtain and showed a woodsy scene, like that's just a mild example. There's so much like really body language in this collection, and what makes it funny and what makes it part of Basile's political project was to put that kind of language in the mouths of kings and queens, into royalty, to really like call into question in some ways their status and authority, like to show how inappropriate they were. So there are lots of kings and queens and princes who are doing completely inappropriate things, and it's part of the humor of the time. So yes, they were literary imaginations and creations of Basile. In the Grimms, it's pretty interesting because the Grimms were super invested in this idea of collecting what they thought were true, German tales, and they believe this is before Germany was its own country. It was a bunch of municipalities or principalities. So they went out and they thought, oh, and it was also occupied by France. So they thought, oh, we'll collect all these tales that are German, and that will be part of like showing that we're a unified culture, and that will help us nationalize. So that was part of their romantic nationalist project. But it turns out, one, that they collect and that they were the voice of the peasants too, right? Folk, the folk. So it turns out that they collected from pretty middle class, educated, mostly women who happened to have emigrated from France. So there were a lot of correspondences with the French tales. But on top of that, they highly, highly edited their tales. And so we actually have copies of the 1910 handwritten version of the collection, or sorry, 1810, the 1812 first edition, all the way to the 1857 seventh edition. And so you can look at how they edited them over time to make them, to control women more, for instance, to draw out some of the anti-Semitism in a few of the tales more, to yeah, to move their ideological project forward. So they're often presented as like collecting tales from the peasants, but they also, I would say, wrote their tales.
Got it. Marcia also asked a question, and you kind of touched on this, are written sources as racist as this one common at this time?
Are written sources as common?
Like the racist, I guess, comments in that, is it common at this time
Oh, is it?
that it was written?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I don't think that Basile was like a lone racist who created these tales with this racist language. And I think the examples of like Lucia and Georgia and the way they're connected to this long tradition that was already racist in its moment is one indication of that. Or the way that, as someone pointed out earlier, Saracens were not black, but the way that they're conflated with that, those were bigger cultural ideas. That wasn't just Basile on his own, right? And then the Grimms too, there's lots and lots of material from the 18th and 19th century that's really super racist, because it was this moment intellectually when people were trying to distinguish or trying to define what distinguished different races from each other, right? So those typologies were super racist, and the Grimms like reproduced a lot of that in their work. Yeah.
Thank you. Here's another long one. This story seems very similar to the child story, The Cruel Sister, where a prince falls in love with the blonde sister, who is then killed by her jealous dark-haired sister. The blonde sister's breastbone is turned into a harp by a wandering minstrel who performs at the wedding and sings the story that exposes the dark-haired sister. Is dark-haired the same thing as black in Northern Europe?
That's a great question. I love that story. And I think that it's an example of the ways that racial difference gets, or the ways that the unkind girl or the false bride is from Basile's time part of a genealogy that is anchored in blackness. And so my interpretive stance is usually that all of those kinds of signifiers are markers of a blackness that has been lost to us. So I would say, yes, it's part of that tradition and part of that genealogy. I'm sure there are people who would disagree with me.
There's a question it's more of a comment and asking for your comments from Live Oak Friends. Over decades or centuries, white is a flexible term. While I am considered white today, at times in our country's past, I would not be considered white due to my Irish and Italian heritage. My family only became white as more immigrants arrived and slaves became emancipated, and the English needed to bolster their numbers. Please comment.
Yes, yes, totally true. I think in the fairy tale context, I would look at Andrew Lang's series, which again published in the late 19th, early 20th century, was super invested in British Empire. And at that moment, British Empire was beginning to feel a little bit precarious because the possibility of Irish emancipation. So again, like categories of whiteness being fluid there, the Irish obviously colonized, seen as, lesser, often with stereotypes of dirtiness that align them with natives of other colonized places. So I think that, yes, the flexibility of the category white definitely appears in this fairy tale tradition. I would say mostly in Lang, because those collections have the most variation, right? And go into the most sort of ethnographic attempts at armchair ethnography in the prefaces. Whereas like in the Grimms, they're just white, like that the white bride who got, she just wants to be beautiful and pure, and God makes her white. Right. So it's just like white or black. We don't get any nuance there. But in Lang, it's more tied to like real cultural nations and people and things like that.
Mm.
Thank you. Do you know who did the translation from Italian to English, and how reliable are those translations?
Oh, another great question. So, Basile's The Tale of Tales was originally published in Neapolitan. So, most often, or in the earliest translations, it was translated into Italian, and then there were translations from sort of standard Italian into English. I use Nancy Canepa's translation. She translated directly from the Neapolitan. It's considered sort of the standard English translation today, I think. Um, but because I do, very close readings, it would be helpful if I read Neapolitan, but I don't. So that's a really good question. I think her translation is quite good. She also includes a lot of footnotes and things from other Italian translations. And I think there may recently, after I finish this manuscript, there might be another translation into English directly from the Neapolitan.
Hmm. All right, Cody has a comment and then a question. So the comment is and question is a little bit broad. In what ways did slavery in the 17th century to present, Africans and Jews, impact the role of society in today's world? Where are we now in terms of equality, equity, well-being, etc.? And then I think the relevant question is, what's the purpose of implementing race or religion in fairy tales such as this?
Good questions, hard questions. I will say, I don't know that this is necessarily answering the question directly, but I will say in the Neapolitan, early Italian context, or that early modern period, we're also seeing the transition from slavery as a system related to kind of war and conquest, and it was a temporary situation. Like slaves were often prisoners of war, and then they were released, and then, or they were uh, kidnapped and then saved, and it just was a much more temporary system. And then we moved to a systematic system of human bondage, right? Like the transatlantic slavery that we're most familiar with. And this was a period, this early modern period when Basile was writing, and a little bit before, was the transition from one system to another. And it was also the emergence of um, blackness being mapped onto slavery in much tighter ways. And so that, I think, speaks some to the question. I think the question is something about, like, from the 17th century on, how has this shaped our society, right? And so in that transition to a system of human bondage that's also specifically racialized, I think that has created a kind of understanding of blackness, right? That is so intimately tied with experiences of slavery, and the issues of equity. It's kind of too big of a question for me to know how to answer, but obviously affects not just perceptions of equity, but actual material experiences of equity, inclusion, recognition, all of the social injustices that we've seen over those centuries. I think I'm not going to say that every single one of them is tied to transatlantic slavery or to slavery as a system of human bondage, but I think that many of them have those associations, right? And then what was the second question that was more?
What's the purpose of implementing race or religion in fairy
Oh,
tales?
and s- by purpose or by implementing by the authors, I'm assuming, is the question. And
Yeah.
I think some of it is intentional, I think, and some of it is probably subconscious, but it's
Mm.
a perspective that is what I argue in the book is, like, the people who were producing these collections were so immersed in these intellectual and cultural and social, political, religious worlds that were often shaped by race in really deep and extensive ways that manifest in these cultural productions, sometimes in more conscious ways. Like when we look at the Grimms, there are several explicitly anti-Semitic tales, and I think and those tales we know have versions where they don't have Jewish characters, but the ones with the Jewish characters are the ones that are in the Grimms, and they get nastier to the Jewish characters over the 7 editions. So we can see, I think, there kind of an intentional ideological project. In Basile, I think, racism was part of his humor, but also just so much the assumption about Black women. It wasn't like he was needed that as part of his ideological project. It was just part of the logic of the time. So it was easy to drive the stories that he was getting at. I don't know if that really answered the question.
I think it did.
Another good question. Considering that many of the fairy tales mentioned use curses and religious justifications for racist attitudes, how did the scientific justifications for racism that rose to popularity around the 18th century influence attitudes around these fairy tales?
Yeah, I would say that we see that most clearly in the Grimms. So that the Grimms were that period, that the 18th century was so um, so heavily invested in quote unquote scientific theories of race, whether that was about climate, like racial difference was related to climate, or whether that was about blood or, whatever the typologies were. There were tons of typologies and there were tons of hypotheses about why racial difference existed. And um, some German thinkers were really at the forefront of those movements. And and the Grimms were scholars in addition to being fairy tale collectors and things. And I argue that they were heavily shaped by these ideas. And the typologies are also really reductive. And so it seemed to me very easy to animate those typologies in the fairy tales themselves, if that makes sense. I don't know if that fully answered the question. Can you ask that question again?
Yeah, let me find it. But I think you answered all of that.
Okay.
So
Okay.
yeah.
All
Thanks.
right. There's a question from Van. Um,
Is that Van
how,
Williams?
it doesn't say.
Oh, if it's Van, I
Um,
owe you a call. I'm sorry.
how is a fairy tale defined, and what are the best examples of a modern fairy tale as opposed to the historical ones you've discussed today?
That is a great question. Um, how a fairy tale is defined is, um, of course, highly debated among fairy tale scholars who spend a lot of time on genre distinctions or trying to come up with a definition of a fairy tale. Um, some very common ways of trying to define a fairy tale include, it exists in a world of where magic is kind of quotidian, where we don't notice the magic. It just is part of the world. It's acceptable. There are people who argue that the that there has to be, that the fairy tale uh, ends in a wedding, and often a rise in social class, that it involves a quest and an attempt to, that it originates in a lack of something or a need that initiates a quest. And at the end of the quest is usually the heterosexual prize. That's kind of how some people define the fairy tale. My favorite contemporary fairy tales are either kids' books or retellings or novels. So my favorite children's picture book is called Princess Smarty Pants, and it's about this girl who doesn't want to get married. She has this big entourage of animals, and her father wants her to get married, and so he brings all these suitors in and they set up all these tasks and none of them can do it, and then one finally does it, so she is supposed to marry him. So she kisses him and he turns into a giant toad, and then he joins her entourage of animals and she doesn't have to get married and she gets to have all her animal friends. So I love that story. Um, my favorite, very, very favorite collection of retold fairy tales is Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, which are dark and complicated and utterly feminist, and just I love them. And then my favorite, I've been reading some fairy tale novels recently, and I read this one called The Snow Child, um, that I just love. It's really stayed with me. So that's what I would say is also like a great one. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks. So this will be our last question. David asks, are there a few counterexamples, such as European fairy tales that actually have darker black heroes or heroines?
Yes. Let me think of um uh there is in the French material there's a I don't I don't know if this is exactly right because it's still like weirdly racist, but it ends up like kind of okay. There's a story called Babiole about a chimpanzee girl, a princess chimpanzee, and you know, she's coded as black in all these ways, and primates were often associated that way. And yet she's like the morally right and good character, and she falls in love with this prince that she's raised with, and then magically she becomes a princess, and they fall in love, and she's not a primate anymore. So in some ways, I feel like that it's totally racist because she starts off as a chimpanzee, and that's associated with blackness in the world of the story, as well as in the broader culture. But it does have this interesting twist at the end, where she's recuperated. And then, there are these these characters who are black girls, and they help the prince accomplish various tasks, but then they are disenchanted and they turn white and beautiful. So I don't like they turn beautiful, which means that they turn white. It's not usually said explicitly, but it's made clear. Sometimes it is explicit, actually, but yeah. I'll
Well,
try to
thank
think of
you.
other examples.
I think that's a good couple.
Thanks.
So thank you so much, everyone, for all of the fantastic questions. Sorry we didn't get to answer all of them. There was just too many. But please join me in a round of virtual applause for Professor Lau. We hope you all enjoyed learning about how culture and race have helped to shape many of the fairy tales that we are all familiar with today. So I definitely learned something new. Please consider making a donation to support the Alumni Association Scholarship Fund. This scholarship supports students with high financial need who have strong academic standing. One of the things that makes this scholarship special is that once a student starts receiving it, they continue to receive the financial support every year until they graduate, providing dependable financial assistance. And we've dropped a link in the chat to that. Our thanks also go out to the staff of the Alumni Relations and Special Events offices who helped organize this webinar. So thank you, Shayna, Diana, Paulina, Nicole, and Kristen. Our next Slugs and Steins is scheduled for Monday evening, November 10th. Meanwhile, UCSC has many other exciting events coming up soon, especially if you are local to Santa Cruz. So between October 15th through the 18th is the Festival of Monsters. October 17th is the Alumni Awards celebration. And November 5th is the Crawl Lecture Series, and their presentation is called Stars to Soil, A Journey from the Big Bang to Planet Earth. There are also a variety of Welcome to the City events throughout California for new alumni over the next month. So on behalf of the UC Santa Cruz Alumni Association, thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.